Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'll give it a few minutes as people join. Okay, I can see people dialing in. I'll give it a few more seconds before we get started. Okay, I can see a few more people joining. Okay, so let's begin. Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Michelle and I'm part of the marketing team here at DDLS and I'll be the moderator for today's session. Before we begin, I'd like to quickly run through some housekeeping. This webinar is in listen mode only and will be recorded and distributed at a later date. This session will run for approximately 45 minutes with Q&A at the end if time permits. If you have any questions, please type them into the question box on the control panel and we'll do our best to address them all. Today, I am pleased to be joined by our End User Adoption and Productivity Manager, Sue Webb. I'd now like to hand it over to Sue.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks everyone for joining us today. So this webinar session is an introduction to the DDLS Microsoft 365 Good Practice Framework. So for those of you that don't know me, my name's Sue Webb. I'm as Michelle just mentioned, my job title is End User Adoption and Productivity Product Manager at DDLS, which is a bit of a mouthful. Basically, I look after all of the end user application products and as well as the GPF that we're just about to hear about. And I also run the consulting service that relates to the Good Practice Framework. I've been with DDLS for coming up to 14 years now. I've worn many hats in that time. I've been a full-time instructor. I've been the principal practitioner for business analysis and also the product manager for all of the process products. And now I've moved into the application space. So the agenda for today, we're going to go through and I'm going to start with a bit of an overview of Microsoft 365 because there's still some confusion about what Microsoft 365 actually is. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit, talk about some of the core products in Microsoft 365 and the ones where we should be seeing the most productivity and not necessarily seeing that. So SharePoint and Teams, OneDrive for Business, talk briefly about the integration between Microsoft 365 and your Office desktop applications. And then we're going to talk about the productivity promise. So when we roll out Microsoft 365 across our organizations, what we're expecting in terms of productivity and collaboration. We'll look at some of the roadblocks that might get in the way of that happening. We're going to have a look at a case study which relates to DDLS's own implementation of what was Office 365 at the time and is now Microsoft 365, which was the genesis for the Good Practice Framework, which will lead us into a discussion around what the GPF actually is. We'll finish off with some lessons learned, a little bit of what's available to help you through this quagmire. And then if we've got a little bit of time left at the end, we'll take some questions and feedback. Otherwise, we'll take your questions offline. So starting with the Microsoft 365 overview. So it's the newer, more broadly encompassing name for Office 365. A lot of people are familiar with Office 365, but weren't really sure what Microsoft 365 is. So it's a subscription service from Microsoft, and it gives you access to a suite of both web-based and desktop communication and productivity tools. And in fact, as of today, the suite of tools continues to grow, and we now have this huge array of tools in the tool belt from Microsoft 365. Now, not all 365 subscribers will have all of the tools. It depends on your subscription model as to which of those tools you'll have. The core tools, of course, being our usual Office applications, so Word, PowerPoint, Excel. The core ones in the cloud are Teams, OneDrive, and SharePoint. So they're the ones that we're going to be talking about today. But what I'm talking about today applies equally to all of those tools. And in fact, we can apply the good practice framework whether you're rolling out 365 as a whole or whether you're rolling out at one aspect of that. So it might be upgrading to Windows 11, for instance, or rolling out Power BI. So just talking about a couple of the main tools. So SharePoint and Microsoft Teams are two of the core tools that we see in the Microsoft 365 platform. And they are designed to work together. So Teams is the core collaboration and communication tool, whereas SharePoint is the core document management tool. And in organizations, we should, if we're using Microsoft 365, we should be using SharePoint and Teams in the place of shared drives and local drives in order to make secure, centralized collaboration, communication, and document management possible. The third of those core tools is OneDrive for Business. So OneDrive for Business allows a company to provide employees with personal storage space that can then be managed from a central location. And when we say personal storage space, we don't mean for storing, photos of your kids. We mean for the document management and document storage, content storage of stuff that's related to you and your job role, but isn't necessarily needed by others in your team, department, or organization. So OneDrive for Business is online storage that's intended for business purposes. It's actually built on SharePoint technology and actually behaves the same way as SharePoint Online in terms of document management. So most businesses that have subscribed to Microsoft 365 will use OneDrive for Business in place of their home drives or shared drives. Well, they should be using it in place of it. Some organizations are using it as well as home drives and shared drives, and that's causing some of their challenges. Now, one of the first questions that we often get asked when we're talking about these tools is, when do I use which tool? So as a general rule, we want to use OneDrive for Business for any files and folders that only need to be accessed by you. So these are your work documents, but they're applicable to you and your job role, but they only need to be accessed by you. For Microsoft Teams, these are files and folders that may also need to be accessed by others within the team. And then SharePoint Online is for files and folders that might need to be accessed by others within that department. But that's just some generic guidance. Most organizations need to decide for themselves what those boundaries are, what those thresholds are. How do I know when to store something in OneDrive? How do I know when to store something in SharePoint or Teams? Now, all of these platforms are integrated with Office. So there are both web application versions of these applications as well as the desktop versions. And all of the tools, so OneDrive, SharePoint, and Teams, are all fully integrated with the Office applications. So that means if you've got a Word document that's stored in Teams, you can open it in Teams, you can open it in the browser in a separate window, or you can open it in the desktop application. So there's full integration. There's also integration with the Office mobile application. So there are mobile versions of each of the applications as well. And that means that you've got access to your content, regardless of whether it's in Teams, OneDrive, or SharePoint, from anywhere, as long as you've got an internet connection. Now, Microsoft 365 comes with it what we refer to as a productivity promise. So there's been a lot of research into this space, and some of the reports that we've unearthed come from an organization called Forrester, and they've reported that a successful Microsoft 365 adoption can give businesses an ROI of between 127 and 162% within 3 years. So that's what's possible. The key word there being that it's a successful Microsoft 365 adoption. So that means that we need not just to have rolled out these tools, but we need the staff to have actually adopted and be using those tools to achieve those gains. The reality is quite different, and there's lots of different reports around this, around different tools. The percentages for Teams is a bit higher, but we certainly see things like we've got organisations that have got more than 100 staff. Significant number of those organisations have rolled out Microsoft 365, but they're seeing less than 20% actual use with tools like OneDrive for Business. And it's even lower for things like SharePoint. SharePoint actually comes in at about 2%. Then this means that they've got staff that are actively using those tools. So the actual adoption rates are really quite low. So what are some of the things that get in the way of achieving those levels of productivity and collaboration? So we're going to have a look at and talk about what some of the roadblocks might be. Now, I'm not suggesting that everybody has a smooth migration of Microsoft 365, but there are lots and lots of tools available. So resources, tools, consultants that are going to help make your migration go smoothly. That's not what we're here for. We're not here to talk about how to migrate to 365. There's lots of resources that'll help that go smoothly. So we're going to assume that you did all of the planning and that your migration was a success. So you've got everything migrated. Now what? Sit back and reap the benefits. That's what we should be doing, right? So what's actually wrong? What's gotten in the way of that reality? So one of the challenges that we come across consistently is that post-migration, users just can't find anything. No one knows how to use SharePoint Online or OneDrive or Teams, let alone when to use which tool. So these can be big challenges for an organisation. One of the things that we see quite often is organisations roll out 365. They've implemented it for technical reasons, for financial benefit reasons, and there's just an assumption that everybody's going to magically know how to use all of the tools, because at the end of the day, it's Office, so it's just Word in the cloud, right? But it's a very, very different to that. So what we also find is that unless you've actually taken the shared drives away, users will still use those file shares, or they'll keep everything on their desktop, or just they keep everything in OneDrive for Business. So they don't know where to put anything, so they just put it all in one place. We also find that if people do manage to find something in SharePoint or Teams, then they'll just download a copy of it and work with an offline copy of it. And we also find that everybody's still attaching files to emails in order to collaborate. Another big challenge is that the service desk gets flooded with questions asking, how do I do this? How do I print? How do I find this document? How do I find my team? How do I find the SharePoint site? Excuse me. So what I'm going to talk about now is, excuse me, the DDLS 365 case study. So DDLS 365 is what we've called our implementation of Microsoft 365. At the time that we actually migrated to the platform, Microsoft 365 didn't exist. It was Office 365. It was a few years ago now, but the case study, the lesson that the lessons that we've learned from this are still very much applicable today. So some of you may know or may not know that the DD in DDLS used to stand for Dimension Data. They were our parent company. So Dimension Data, or DI Data, were divesting themselves of all of their non-core business units. So DDLS, which was Dimension Data Learning Solutions, only existed in Australia. Dimension Data didn't have any education organisations anywhere else in the world. So therefore we were non-core. So they made the decision to sell us. Now, DI Data were not just our parent company, they were also our IT service provider. So they hosted and or managed all of our corporate IT infrastructure. The only infrastructure they didn't look after was our classrooms. So the infrastructure that they did manage included our CRM, our on-prem SharePoint intranet, our file shares, our phone systems, and our Exchange server. So we created a migration project, and the chief goal of the project was to get everything off Didata's infrastructure by a fixed date. So we had until the end of the calendar year to get everything migrated off of their infrastructure. So as I mentioned, most of our corporate content was either in file shares or on our SharePoint intranet. So the first decision we had to make was, what were we going to migrate it to? Were we going to build like for like technology, build our own on-prem servers and migrate to those? We didn't want to do that. We didn't want to actually implement a bunch of outdated technology. So the decision was made to go to Office 365 as our platform / replacement. So as a project team, we had a typical sort of plan. So analyze the current state, determine the desired future state, work out which bits of the current state we needed to keep, remove, add, and change to get to that desired future state, and then prioritize all of the tasks. So work out using Moscow, what things we must do, what things we should do, what things we could do, what things we won't do. Now, all of this was happening, and during the time while all this was happening, the clock was ticking, and there were other changes that were happening in the business which impacted on the project. And in the end, we ended up having to de-scope a lot of the could-haves and should-haves because we were running out of time. So the scope ended up being basically map everything to its new locations, migrate everything, and do as much testing as time would allow. So that's what we did. And we got everything migrated and tested with about 3 days before the deadline. So we just scraped in. And of course, that, as I said, that was the end of a calendar year. Now, DDLS closes for 2 weeks every year to give all of the staff a break, and because we have a sort of quiet period over Christmas. So we'd finished the migration just before we broke for the Christmas break. And so 2 weeks later, everybody came back to work, and it was a new year, and that brought lots of new challenges with it. So we had new owners again, so not the people that Didata had sold us to, but another organisation who are still our current owners now, and it's been a lovely journey to go through with them. We had a new standard operating environment for the majority of staff. So most staff work on devices that have a managed operating environment or a standard operating environment. And that new SOE had a new operating system in it and a new version of Office. So turn up back to work after Christmas holidays, and all of a sudden you've got a new operating system, you've got a new version of Office, got a new phone system. So we'd gone from desktop phones to VoIP phones and using Skype for Business. So everybody had to learn how to use that. We had a new intranet. So our old intranet was SharePoint on-prem, and we'd gone to SharePoint online. And the final sort of nail in the coffin, if you like, was that there were no more file shares. The file shares were gone. There were no file shares whatsoever. So people couldn't fall back into those old habits because the old systems just weren't there. Now, we're a training company, so we made the assumption that training would solve all of the issues. So training to the rescue. So we ran product training sessions for all of our internal staff, and those sessions covered office.com, so what you see when you sign into office.com, etc. It covered Skype for Business, how to make, receive phone calls, send messages, etc. Covered OneDrive for Business, because that was where our everything that had previously been on our H drives should now be. And we also covered SharePoint Online. Now, when I talk about product training, I'll explain what I mean by product training shortly. Basically, we showed everybody in the business how to use the tools. And we're a training organisation. We felt that that was what we needed to do, was teach people how to use the tools, and then that would solve all of our problems for us. So we'd migrated all of the content, we'd gotten all of our new systems up and running, we'd trained all of our staff. So we should have been reaping the benefits of Office 365, right? but the reality was that just about everybody was struggling. We were getting lots of feedback, and the feedback was that the training hadn't really helped. Now, for me, who on the project, my role had been business analyst and subject matter expert. So I was seeing all of this feedback coming back in. I hadn't actually done the training, but I'd been seeing all the feedback coming back in, and I'd had people talking to me about the project. And it was all sounding really familiar to me. And the reason it was sounding familiar to me was because I'd heard similar stories from some of our clients. So I'm based in Western Australia. We have a very large mining and resources sector here. And one of the biggest mining and resources organisations who are based here in WA, they are one of our clients, and they'd come to us, and I'd engaged with them in to develop some bespoke training content for them. So what had happened, they'd done a soft launch of 365, and again, it would have been Office 365, and they'd done their soft launch 18 months prior to them coming to us. So they basically made a technical and financial decision to move to Office 365, and they'd implemented it, but they hadn't done anything else. And then 18 months later, the senior leadership team couldn't understand why nobody was actually using Office 365. They'd looked at the usage reports and were really shocked to see just how low the utilisation of that was. So they thought, well, we haven't really taught anybody how to use it properly. If we're going to have people using it, we better make sure that our support teams are properly trained. So they sent their functional support team to me in 2 training sessions to help them with that. So my role was to train up their support team. Now, they had done this soft launch. As I said, nobody was actually using it. We were going through the training and talking about how to use, because I was teaching them how to use OneDrive, how to use SharePoint. Teams had started to exist by then, so we were looking at Teams as well, and all of the other tools. We looked at OneNote, Outlook, etc. How to use all of those tools. What we learned during that exercise, and by engaging with the functional support team, they said, well, okay, that's fine and all fine and well, Sue, you've told us how to use these tools, but you haven't told us when and why. And I said, well, I can't tell you that. That has to come from your organisation. So that started to plant the seeds for what has then evolved into the model that evolved into the good practice framework that we're here to learn about. Now, another one of our clients is a not-for-profit in the education sector, very large organisation. And in that organisation, everybody thought or assumed that Office 365 was just cloud versions of the desktop applications plus a cloud version of SharePoint. They honestly thought that that was the limit of 365. And they were still just using all of their desktop applications because they were like, well, I don't need to use the cloud ones because I've got the desktop ones. So they assumed that that's all there was to it. So one of the things that became apparent very quickly to me was that while we could help our clients with how to use the 365 productivity tools, what I now refer to as product training, our clients had to work out for themselves when and why to use the different tools. And that's what I refer to as process training. So with those client experiences in mind, and with what happened at DDLS with our implementation, I developed the model that then evolved into the Microsoft 365 Good Practice Framework. So the M365 GPF, or Good Practice Framework, is, in my mind, it's a resolution to many of those roadblocks. So we understand that training is absolutely critical to an implementation of 365, that we cannot assume that everybody is going to magically know how to use Teams, how to use OneDrive, how to use SharePoint. So training, product training, knowing how to use the products is still core to this solution. But what we recognise is that product training on its own is not going to solve those problems. So we also need process training. We need to understand the how and the why. We need to understand in a particular organization, how does somebody, for instance, submit a leave request? How do they create an invoice? What do they need to know about how to actually perform their organizational processes within that environment? So process training is another critical part of the training piece of the GPF. But we also recognize that the process training needs to be centered on guidance. We need guidance to help understand, corporate guidance to understand when and why to use which tool. So when do I use SharePoint? When do I use OneDrive? When do I use Teams? If it's SharePoint, which site collection does it need to go into? What else needs to happen? Are there any other tools that we're using in conjunction with these document libraries? Are we using some of the Power tools? Are we using Power Automate? Are we using and Power Apps? Having guidance, we can't make guidance stick. We can't without governance. So the guidance piece needs to be centered on governance. So we need underlying policies to help the staff members understand the when and the why to use which tool. And the guidance would also need to include things like content classification. So how do we classify content so that that helps us to understand where it needs to be created, where it needs to be stored, what processes it needs to go through in terms of both document management and records management. All of that needs to come through and be rooted in policies. And that's also where the risk management piece sits, as well as in that governance piece, which everything is centered on. But even with training, guidance and governance, if we just cover those three elements, we're not going to be able to get the changes to stick. And chances are we're going to run into, especially with 365, because there's so many aspects to it, there's so many tools in it that we saw earlier in that wheel, that we need something in place to avoid change fatigue and to get the changes to stick. And for that, we need change management. So organizational change management to help get the changes to stick and to address change fatigue. And the change management piece could be as simple as identifying change champions, training your change champions at a higher level, but also monitoring how many changes you're rolling out at once and making sure that you're not doing what we did, which is overwhelming staff by changing absolutely everything all in one go. So I took that GPF, I had designed that model, albeit it was, it had been on a whiteboard and I'd taken a photo of it, and I then went and sat in front of some of the senior leadership team at DDLS, and I drew the GPF for them on a piece of paper, and I showed them what I intended, and I said, I think this can solve our problems, all these problems that we've got from our rollout. So they said, great idea. They basically gave me carte blanche to see if I could solve the issues that we were having. And so what we did then was reached out to all of our staff. We surveyed all of our staff and collected their pain points. So by collecting their pain points, you know, what can't you do? What are you having trouble with? That then gave us new product training requirements. So that helped us to understand what our training requirements were going forward. And then from that training scope, we could determine what guidance was needed. So we developed guidance on how to classify content, and also guidance around what could be shared and with who, because we had some content that could only be shared internally and other content that could be shared externally, and they had to be shared through different avenues. So the governance needed became obvious from the first two elements. So we knew from the training that we were going to be delivering and from the guidance that we needed to develop for that training that we also needed a content classification policy and a content sharing policy. And for the change management piece, we identified change champions. So these are people within their various business units who received training at a slightly higher level than everybody else. So they were a little bit further ahead and got more in-depth training around the different 365 tools. So they were then able to support their teammates and help their teammates out, whether it was just helping them out in a meeting, oh, here, I can show you how to do that, or whether it was more formal help that they were providing. We also include Microsoft 365 training in our induction process now. So when we have new staff coming on board, they can get trained up and achieve and receive the guidance as well. And we also continue to deliver lunch and learn sessions. One of the things that we do very frequently, in fact, we've got one tomorrow, is we run lunch and learn sessions on a whole range of things across the business, but we quite frequently have them. And it could be sort of every 6 months, I'll run one on Teams and say, this is what's new in Teams that's changed since the last sort of training we did. Or it could be, you know, here's how to use OneNote and this is going to make your life easier, whatever it is. But we're running those lunch and learn sessions as well as offering training and product training. So the things that we learned from that implementation, we learned that very importantly that the project isn't finished when the migration finishes. So one of the things that we were under the misapprehension was that once we did the migration and we got all the content into 365, that we could sit back and relax and breathe a sigh of relief because the project was finished. But the project was a long way from being finished. We really needed to include the GPF components into that project and include them in the timeline. Other lessons, recognizing that users or that the information workers don't just need product training, they also need process training. The process training needs the other elements of the good practice framework to be effective and for the changes to stick. And it's a saying that I've adopted from something that I used to say. I was a SharePoint trainer for many years, and I always used to say to my SharePoint students, SharePoint without governance and guidance is chaos. That has now evolved, and it's now Microsoft 365 without governance and guidance is chaos. And that's the reality of it, that we need the governance and the guidance. We need the process training, not just the product training. Now, to help you to understand not just the project, but everything that sort of led up to there, as well as the current situation around levels of adoption of Microsoft 365, DDLS are publishing a new ebook. So this is our latest publication. And the ebook is called Your Guide to End User Adoption. So the ebook goes through many of the factors that have been introduced in this webinar. And the idea of the ebook is that it will give you some help to achieve high levels of collaboration and productivity with Microsoft 365. So there'll be a link to that ebook coming out with the next newsletter. So keep an eye out for that. The other services that we have available, we have a new consulting service. So specifically for the GPF, we've got a GPF consulting service. So DDLS are excited to launch a new consulting service. And this is for organizations that are looking to address the multiple products that sit within the end user application and adoption space, such as the Microsoft 365 system. So whether you need to build a change management program to support adoption, whether you need to develop rules around the tools to create more security, whether you need to develop a document library to support your business access to the data and insights needed, whether you need to manage the risks of what's contained within these ecosystems, the consulting service can help you with that. So I'm leading up the consulting service. So I'm the subject matter expert for this space and also the creator of the framework. So I'm looking forward to connecting with you as you consider the wider benefits that these end user tools can have on your business. So that's a brand new service. We've also got 2 new workshops, and these will be available in February 2022. So we've got 2 new workshops. They're both one-day workshops. One is a workshop for the GPF itself. So it's a one-day workshop to guide you through the need for the GPF, what each element of the GPF is and how to implement it. And you'll also leave the workshop with templates and examples of each element of the GPF. The second workshop is a document management workshop. So it also leverages the GPF, but it's going to help you to understand the differences and similarities between the 3 main M365 collaboration tools, which are Teams, SharePoint Online, and OneDrive for Business. And it's then going to guide you through how to do document management in each. Now that second workshop there, the document management one, it's something that's grown out of something that I've seen many times when I've been teaching Teams or SharePoint, that often people aren't aware of just exactly how to do document management in Teams in particular, because there's some document management stuff you can do in Teams and other stuff you've actually got to switch from Teams into SharePoint. Often people aren't even aware that SharePoint sits behind Teams, that all of the Teams document management stuff is actually SharePoint. So knowing when you've got to switch into SharePoint. So doing things, if you need to share a document, if you need to change permissions on it, all of those types of things. How do I check out a document? All of those things are done. We're talking about document management. We're talking about the full life cycle of your documents within those platforms. And as I said, it all leverages the GPF. So it'll help you work out what your guidance is relating to each of those tools and then learn how to do document management within the right tools. Now, anybody attending this webinar, we're offering a 20% discount for webinar attendees on those workshops. So you can contact your account manager or you can contact training@ddls.com.au. And if you quote GPF webinar, that will allow you to get that discount. And I've flown through that. So we've gone through all the content already. So we've got some time for questions and feedback if there's anybody on the call that wants to ask a question. Not seeing any questions come through, Michelle.
No, I don't see any questions. I'll give it a few more seconds in case someone has a question to ask. Okay, looks like someone is typing one at the moment. We'll wait for that to come through.
Brilliant. So there's a question come through, good points on the GPF. The lunch and learn done in person or through Teams online. We do all our lunch and learns remotely. We do them all pretty much through Teams these days. We're a nationwide organisation. We have people all across the country and we've got divisions in New Zealand and the Philippines. So we need to run all of those sessions remotely. Thanks for the question. Okay, another question. What do you think the best way to handle a situation where an org has a really messy M365 deployment without governance already in place? Better to start from scratch or try and mend the broken SharePoint and Teams already in place? So part of the GPF, part of the consulting piece is a quality management framework. And one of the core components of that, which we actually have adopted from ITIL 4, is start from where you are. It's never too late to start, and you always use your current situation as your starting point. It would take a little bit of analysis to have a look at their situation to see whether they're going to be better off trying to sort of build some new, say, SharePoint sites and then migrate the content to that. And the same with Teams, so do some consolidation and some cleaning up. It's usually, the answer to that is it's in a depends question. So we had another question. How long did it take DDLS to move from the chaos adoption to current adoption levels? Well, so one thing I will say, so I mentioned before that one of the symptoms of needing the GPF is your service desk getting bombarded with how do I questions. That was one of the ways we measured the success of our intervention, if you like, which was after we did the new lots of training where we rolled out new training that incorporated the governance and guidance into the training. So people were learning not just how to use the tools, but also why and when. Once we did that second lot of training, then we saw the numbers of help desk requests actually plummeted. They went from, they dropped by something like was like 80 or 90%. I can't remember the exact figure, but it dropped very quickly. So we were then, we got to those levels of adoption fairly quickly. I've got to, be honest about the fact that COVID did increase our adoption. There were still people who were working in the office every day and were a bit more reluctant to still use some of the newer tools. And then, of course, when COVID hit and we all had to work remotely, nobody sort of had a choice. But, obviously we still needed people to be doing things the correct way. So we had to reinforce some of those things. But certainly even within a month, that adoption within DDLS had increased massively. And the number of help desk requests dropped massively as well.
Okay, we still have 5 minutes. If anyone has any other questions, feel free to ask. Okay, I think that's,
yeah, so in regards to adoption success, any other measures you use? Service desk, sometimes no calls means no use at all. And that's a good point as well, that people could have given up trying to get help from the service desk as well. Look, with adoption, there's lots of tools built into Microsoft 365 where you can see the usage statistics. So always looking at those usage stats is a good way to look at that. Some of it's anecdotal, it's listening to people, and sometimes you just have to ask people how they're going with the tools. There are other things that you can do to increase adoption, like talked earlier about the fact that some organizations leave their shared drives in place, making them read only so people can't keep putting new content there. Reinforcing the policies that you've defined in your governance, in the governance section of the GPF is really important. But some of it just comes down to anecdotal. Great question. So another part to that question, the focus has been on office workers. What about people external, outdoors, on the tools, any experience? Not a lot, though I have done some work with the WA Police and their police force. The people out on the beat, they only use mobile phones now. They don't have laptops in the patrol cars anymore. They don't have tablets or anything like that. So they're doing everything on mobiles. And so that was a bit of a challenge because it's a very different environment, and then teaching them how to use the tools when they're out and about. So it's still possible. You just got to think about the fact that they're probably not using a computer, that they're possibly using a mobile phone, and that the experience is quite different. Thanks for your questions. So Michelle, I think we might wrap it up.
Yep, I don't see any more questions come through, and we've got a minute left. Okay, no more questions coming through. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and especially Sue for that insightful session. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.